Chapter 10. Matt. Hurrying through the family room, Matt held up a hand to Dylan and Kayla, who were standing near the front door with worried expressions. The blinds were down, covering the two long, narrow windows on either side of the front door, so Matt couldn't see who it was. "I'll handle this." They nodded and stepped out of the way. Matt lifted a slat on the blinds, peeking out through one of the side lights. "Who is it?" Jessica whispered from beside him. He turned and frowned. "Our neighbor, Jack Peters." Pounding sounded again, putting Matt on edge. "What do you think he wants?" Jessica asked, as Dylan and Kayla huddled around her. He shook his head. "No idea." Matt pulled the blinds up, and Jack came into view. Jack's gaze shifted to Matt. Wild-eyed, Jack practically pressed his face against the glass. "I need help!" "What's going on?" Matt asked, as alarm flared inside him. Jack and his family lived 2 doors down. Matt didn't know him well, just well enough to chat with him if they both happened to be outside at the same time. Jack was Matt's age, late 30s, and married. He and his wife had 2 school-aged children. "They're all sick," Jack said, as tears filled his eyes. "All of them!" Alarm turned to empathy. "Your family?" Jack nodded. "We need help." Matt had no idea what he could possibly do to help them. "Have you called your doctor?" The answer sounded lame even to him. Jack's family would most likely die. Calling the doctor would be a waste of energy. "Yes," Jack said, his face nearly crumpling. "The doctor's office just had a recording to call 911, but when I did, I got a busy signal." Panic swelled in Jack's eyes. "I called and called and called, but no one's answering." Fresh alarm swelled inside Matt, but he tamped it down. "I'm sorry, Jack." Jack's eyes widened. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't help." Baffled as to what to do, Matt shook his head. "There's nothing I can do." Jack turned away from the window and battered the door with both fists. "Open the damn door!" Kayla screamed. "Don't open it!" Jessica shouted. Turning to his family and holding up a hand, Matt gave them a look that said, "I've got this." Then he looked back at Jack, whose palms were now flattened against the glass. Speaking calmly yet firmly, Matt said, "You know I can't open the door, Jack. Now go home to your family and make them comfortable." An image of his own family, sick and dying, flashed through his head, and he almost lost his cool. But he couldn't think about that. He had to keep his composure, had to keep Jack away from his front door. Jack began. Then he lowered his head as tears dripped down his face. His head lifted, and he looked at Matt, pleading in his eyes. "Do you have any Tylenol to ease their pain?" They had lots of Tylenol, and Matt was completely willing to give some to Jack, but he couldn't open the door. He couldn't chance exposing his family to the virus. "Tell you what," Matt said. "Come back in half an hour, and I'll leave some Tylenol on our porch." Relief flooded Jack's face. "Thank you." Glad he could do something that might help, but wouldn't endanger his family, Matt watched Jack turn around and make his way down the walkway to the sidewalk. When he was out of sight, Matt turned to face his family. They stared at him in silence. "That really freaked me out," Kayla finally said, her voice nearly shaking. "Me too," Dylan added. Matt's eyes sought out Jessica, who smiled softly at him before placing her hand on his arm. "You're a good man, Matt Bronson." Matt smiled at her. "Why did you tell him to wait half an hour?" Dylan asked. Looking at his son, Matt said, "Jack didn't look sick, but in case he is, I wanted to give the air by the door time to clear out." Dylan nodded. "Makes sense. Is that enough time?" Jessica asked. Matt had no idea. "You can't open the front door," Kayla said. What if the virus is still in the air and it gets in the house? Wait, Dylan said. All eyes shifted to him. What if you go out through the garage? Then you won't need to open the front door. You're brilliant, son, Dylan beamed. I'll get a bottle of Tylenol, Jessica said. Then she went into the kitchen. Moments later, she was back, holding a small baggie with some pills in it. I don't think we should give away an entire bottle, she grimaced and held up the bag. This should be enough to hold them for a while. Matt knew what she was saying. Jack's family would be dead within hours. They didn't need an entire bottle of pills. Leaning forward, Matt kissed Jessica on the lips. Then he took the baggie from her. He put on a face mask, then walked to the door that led to the garage. I'll be back in a minute. He opened the door and went into the garage, then went to the man door that led to the backyard, opening it and stepping outside. The sun shone brightly, belying the turmoil that lay beneath its bright orb. Matt tilted his face toward the sun, soaking up its warmth. Then he turned to the gate that led to the front of the house, reaching for the latch. He hesitated. He hadn't been out front in days. What would he find? Drawing in a lungful of air, he braced himself, exhaled, then opened the gate and stepped through, the baggie of Tylenol in his hand and the mask covering his nose and mouth. Nothing. That's what he saw. Nothing and no one. All was silent, eerily silent. It was a spring afternoon. Children should have been outside playing, riding bikes. People should have been mowing their lawns, working in their yards. Instead, not a soul could be seen. Frowning, Matt strode across his driveway and toward the walkway that led to his front door. Movement caught his eye. It was Jack. He'd been hiding around the corner of Matt's house, but now he was barreling toward Matt, his eyes wild with fear. Sheer panic engulfed Matt. Flinging the baggie of pills in Jack's direction, Matt spun on his heel and bolted back in the direction he'd come. Wait! Jack screamed from 10 feet behind him, pure hysteria in his voice. I need your help! Ignoring Jack's plea, Matt propelled himself through the open gate, then slammed it closed behind him. A second later, Jack crashed into the vinyl gate, rattling it on its hinges. Not waiting to see if Jack would open the gate and come through, Matt burst through the man door, shutting it behind him with a bang before turning the deadbolt. Chest heaving and heart hammering against his ribs, Matt bent over, placing his hands on his knees. He didn't know how much his family had witnessed, but he didn't want them to see the terror in his eyes. So he took a moment to catch his breath and gather his emotions. Chapter 11. Jessica. Jessica admitted it. She'd been terrified to have Matt go outside and into their own front yard. What was the world coming to? A week ago, she wouldn't have thought twice about it. But now, everything had changed. Friends and family were dropping like flies, and she and Matt had to do all within their power to keep their family safe. She stood beside the sidelight, anxious to know what was happening. All of a sudden, Jack raced across the lawn in the direction Matt was coming from. Panic, stark and clear, shot through her, and she flew to the front window to see what was happening. The kids were right on her heels. "What's going on?" Kayla asked, her voice constricted with fear. The three of them stood at the front window, but they couldn't see a thing, not with the way the house was situated. Jack had run to their left, toward the garage side of the house. Jessica had heard him yelling that he needed help, but that was all she'd been able to see. "Dad needs us. What should we do?" Dylan asked, his eyes wide. Jessica thought about the gun and ammo she'd seen Matt bring in on the day of his shopping spree. Matt had shown her where he was storing his weapons. Not taking the time to answer Dylan, Jessica ran to the closet in the master bedroom and quickly found a gun. Then she grabbed a loaded magazine before dashing to the garage. She pressed her ear against the door, but after hearing nothing, she opened the door, her gaze darting around the space until she saw Matt, bent forward with his hands on his knees. "Matt," she said. He straightened and spun around, his eyes wide as he took off his face mask. "Jess, what are you doing?" Seeing that he was alone and that the door leading to the backyard was locked, she took the 2 steps down into the garage, and with the gun pointed at the floor and the magazine in her other hand, she walked toward Matt. "Are you okay?" "Yeah. I saw Jack running." She stopped beside Matt and held out the gun for him to take. "I was worried, so I brought you this." He stared at the gun in her hand like it was a foreign object, and he gazed at her before finally taking it and the magazine from her. Not sure what she expected him to do, she stood there watching him, waiting for some kind of guidance. When he didn't say anything, she asked, "What happened out there?" With a look of disbelief, he slowly shook his head. "Jack's gone stark raving mad." At that moment, pounding sounded on the man door. Jessica let out a scream, her heart in her throat. "Is that him?" Matt's gaze shot to the door, then he shoved the magazine into the gun. "Yeah." He seemed rather calm, which helped to settle Jessica's nerves. Matt walked to the door and shouted, "Jack, calm down." "Open the door!" Jack yelled. "Open it right now!" Matt shook his head. "No can do, man. The Tylenol is out front. Grab it, then get off my property." "Or what?" Jack said, his voice shaky yet defiant. Matt racked the slide, the sound loud and clear. "Or I will shoot you." Jessica stared at Matt, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Would Matt really do that? But one look at his face, and she believed him wholeheartedly. There was silence on the other side of the door. "Do you think he left?" she whispered. Matt looked at her, his expression serious. "Don't know, but I'm not gonna open the door to find out." They stood there for at least 2 minutes before Matt lowered the gun. "Let's go inside," he said, tucking the gun into the back of his waistband. Jessica was more than happy to comply. She led the way, and the moment they stepped into the house, the kids began asking what had happened. Matt came into the house, locking the door behind him. Then, without answering the kids, he strode to the front room. Jessica and the kids followed him. When they caught up with him, Jessica looked over his shoulder as he peered out the window, and to her great relief, she saw Jack trudging down the sidewalk, away from their house. Exhaling audibly, Jessica felt her shoulders begin to relax. "He's gone," she said. "But will he come back?" Matt muttered. She didn't want to consider that, but she knew Matt was right. After all, Jack had hidden in the shadows, waiting for Matt to appear. Who knew what he was capable of? His family was dying. He had to be desperate. Matt stepped away from the window and turned to Jessica and the kids. "I'm going to board up the windows by the front door. Anything to keep them safe." "Good idea." "I want to help," Dylan said. "What happened out there?" Kayla asked. "I mean, we saw Jack running, Dad. Did he—" Her eyebrows tugged together. "Did he touch you?" Matt smiled and shook his head. "No, sweetie. I made it back into the garage before he caught up with me." This was surreal. Their neighbor had chased Matt down, and Matt had threatened to shoot him if he didn't leave, all because of a virus, a deadly virus. Blinking to clear her mind, Jessica forced a smile, but she felt like a fraud. She'd never been so worried and so terrified in her life. She liked to be in control, and right now, she wasn't. Not in any way, shape, or form. And she was pretty sure she wouldn't be for a long, long time. While Matt and Dylan went out to the garage to get scraps of wood, along with hammer and nails, Jessica thought about Jack's comment that no one was answering 911. Curious if he was exaggerating, she went into her bedroom and closed the door, then dialed 911. A moment later, a busy signal sounded, just as Jack had said. Frowning, Jessica tried again. Same result. Then she tried one more time. Busy. What was happening? Why was no one answering? Was help even available? Was everyone home with their families? Or were so many people sick or dead that there simply weren't enough people to help? The thought that there was no one to call in an emergency made Jessica extremely nervous. What if someone got hurt? Or what if someone tried to break in? What if Jack came back with a gun of his own and shot his way into their house? There was no one to call for help. It was all up to them. With shaking hands, Jessica tucked her phone into her back pocket. They were on their own. Chapter 12. Matt. "We'll have to cut this down to a narrower size," Matt said, as he hefted a large sheet of plywood. It was left over from a woodworking project he'd recently completed. He'd almost tossed it, but now he was glad he hadn't. Dylan helped him move some things around in the garage so he could wheel his table saw into a space where he could work. A few minutes later, they had 2 long, narrow sheets of plywood that would fit perfectly over the side lights. "Grab the hammer," he said to Dylan. Then, with the 2 sections of wood in his hands, he turned to go into the house. "Dad," Dylan said, his tone stopping Matt in his tracks. "Yeah?" He lowered his arms so that the edge of the wood rested on the ground, then he turned to Dylan. With his hands holding the hammer and a box of nails, Dylan gestured to Matt's back with his chin. "Why do you have a gun in the back of your pants?" He'd forgotten that was there, but after what had happened with Jack, he had every intention of keeping it handy. He said. "Just in case." Dylan grinned. "Can I have a gun?" "No," Matt said, without thinking. Then he realized he should probably take some time to teach both Dylan and Kayla how to use his guns. At a minimum, he needed to review gun safety. At the look of disappointment on Dylan's face, he smiled. "You can't have a gun, but I'll show you how to use it. Okay?" Dylan's face lit up. "Okay." He thought about Jessica. She wasn't going to be happy about what he'd just promised. Not able to worry about that just then, he picked up the wood and carried it into the house. Then he and Dylan nailed the boards into place. It looked eerie and kind of creepy to have wood covering the glass, but if that's what it took to keep deranged neighbors and anyone else who might wish to do them harm from getting inside, or at least slowing any intruders down, then the boards would stay. "Dad's gonna show me how to use a gun," Dylan said. Matt turned around to see who he was telling, hoping it was Kayla so he would have a chance to talk to Jessica about it first, but no luck. "Oh, really?" Jessica said, her eyebrows nearly in her hairline as she looked at Matt. "Yeah," Dylan said, excitement in his voice. "Then I might get a gun of my own." Now Jessica's eyes widened as she stared at Matt. "Can I talk to you?" "Yeah, sure. Let me put my tools away and then we can go into my office." After putting the hammer and box of nails in the garage, Matt turned to Dylan. "Let me know if anyone comes to the door, but don't open it." Dylan rolled his eyes. "Of course not, Dad." "Thanks." Matt went into his office with Jessica. She closed the door and sat in his desk chair. He sat in the other chair. "The kids need to know how to use guns safely." "That's not what I want to talk to you about." That surprised him. "Okay." She scraped a hand through her hair. "I called 911. "What for?" he asked, cutting her off. Would he get in trouble for threatening to shoot Jack? I wanted to see if they would answer. That's when he remembered Jack telling them that no one had picked up when he'd called 911. Oh, and? She clutched her hands together. I tried 3 separate times, and each time all I got was a busy signal. That was deeply concerning. Let's try again. Maybe it'll be working now. She nodded, clearly eager to be proven wrong. Matt pulled his phone out of his pocket, dialed 911, then put the phone on speaker. A busy signal filled the silence. Jessica cupped her face with her hands, her eyebrows drawing together. See? Quietly sighing, Matt put his phone back in his pocket. Jessica dropped her hands to her lap. There's no one to help us. If someone gets hurt, we're on our own. If the house catches fire, we're on our own. Her voice became louder with each sentence. If someone wants to hurt us, Matt. Her eyes were bracketed with terror. We'll be on our own. Knowing they had no one to turn to in a true emergency made Matt feel cut off. And after what had happened with Jack, he was wary to reach out to his neighbors. Suddenly, it didn't seem so crazy to teach his 14-year-old son how to use a handgun. What are we going to do? Jessica asked, as her hands twisted together in her lap. I mean, what if Jack comes back with a gun and forces his way inside? That's not going to happen. You don't know that. His shoulders slumped. No, I don't. Then he straightened in his seat. But you don't know that he will. So let's not assume the worst. She sighed. Fine. When they finished speaking, Matt stood, prepared to discuss gun safety with his family. Are you ready? Jessica asked, as she stood beside him. He nodded, not liking that he was being forced to teach his 14-year-old son and 16-year-old daughter how to use a gun in self-defense against neighbors. Yeah, he murmured. Side by side, he and Jessica walked into the family room. But when they crossed the threshold, they found Kayla and Dylan sitting on the couch in the family room, with Kayla holding the remote and frantically changing channels. What's going on? Matt asked. Kayla turned and looked at him, her eyes wide. None of the news channels are on. What? He held out his hand, and she gave him the remote. He went to their favorite local channel, but it was showing a sitcom. That's weird. For the last 2 days, it seemed as if the only thing all the news channels were broadcasting was information about the bird flu. Maybe people were tired of hearing about the flu. Then he went to Fox News. Vertical colored bars covered the screen. They were off the air. Stunned to see something he'd never expected to see on a 24-hour news station, he felt his mouth fall open as he turned to Jessica, who looked just as shocked as he felt. It's the beginning of the end, isn't it? She whispered. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but he couldn't deny the obvious. Yeah. Chapter 13. Jessica. Jessica was having a hard time accepting what Matt had just acknowledged. The end had come. The end to all she'd known. The end to safety and security. The end to her easy life. To the comforts she'd always taken for granted. The end to society. The end to life as she knew it. What's happening? Kayla asked, her voice gushing fear. With her throat filling with a rapidly growing knot, Jessica couldn't speak. Instead, she placed what she hoped was a comforting hand on Kayla's shoulder. The newscasters aren't on, Matt said, stating the obvious. They're all dead, right, Dad? Dylan asked, his eyes tight with distress. Matt had a grim look on his face. I don't know. They probably just don't have enough people to run things. No, Kayla said. They're all dead. With the matter-of-fact way Kayla had said that, Jessica didn't know how to reply, because she knew her daughter was right. The doorbell rang. They all froze. Jessica's gaze shot to Matt, whose eyes were wide as he stared at the front door. With the side lights boarded up, they had no way to see who was on the porch. There was no peephole. "Who do you think it is?" Kayla frantically whispered as she stood from the couch. An image of their desperate neighbor, Jack, flew into Jessica's mind. It had only been a few hours since he'd been there. Had his family died? Had he come back with a gun, ready to kill them all? Terror wound its way up Jessica's throat. She could hardly breathe. A knock sounded. Not the pounding that Jack had done earlier, but a soft, hesitant tapping. That almost made it worse, like he was trying to draw them out. Matt moved toward the front door. "No!" Jessica whisper-screamed. What if Jack had a gun? What if he shot through the door and hit Matt? Killed Matt? Matt stopped and turned to her. After a moment, he softly sighed before walking the rest of the way to the door. "Who is it?" he called through the door. Jessica's gaze was riveted to the door. "Brooke," a soft voice answered. It wasn't Jack. Slumping in relief, Jessica shifted her gaze to Matt, who turned and looked at her with a question in his eyes. "She might be infected," Dylan said. "She's an orphan," Kayla said, her voice hitching like she was trying to hold back tears. Jessica regarded her daughter, trying to imagine what it would be like if Kayla was left completely alone and went to Brooke's family for shelter. What if they turned her away? The thought broke her heart. Then she thought about her mom and Rochelle. Dead. So many dead. They couldn't leave Brooke out on her own. "We have to help her," Jessica heard herself say. Matt stared at her, then he turned to the door. "Are you sick?" "No," Brooke said. "Come to the living room window." He walked to the large window and opened the blinds. Jessica and the kids followed. A moment later, Brooke came into view. Her hair was disheveled, she looked exhausted, and she had a backpack slung over her shoulders. But she didn't look sick. Good color in her face, eyes clear. She just looked like someone who had been through hell. "Are you alone?" Matt asked. Brooke glanced to the side as a German shepherd appeared next to her. "Cleo's with me." "Okay, hold on a minute." She nodded again. "You're not gonna let her in, are you?" Dylan asked, his face panic-stricken. "If she's infected, she'll kill us all." Matt's gaze went from Jessica to Dylan to Kayla. "I don't think she's sick." "You can't know that," Dylan said, his voice tense. "I have an idea," he said. Then he turned to Kayla. "Gather some blankets and a pillow." Kayla's eyebrows bunched, but she nodded, then left the room. A few moments later, she was back with what he'd requested. "Follow me," he said, before turning and walking out to the garage. All three of them followed him, watching as he took an air mattress from a shelf, blew it up, then spread blankets on it. "What if she and Cleo stay in here until the incubation period has passed? If Brooke's healthy, she and Cleo can come in." He looked at each of them, clearly wanting their agreement. "That's a good idea," Jessica said. "Yes," Kayla said, as a relieved smile lit her face. "Yeah," Dylan added, "I guess that would be okay. Let me put some food and water out there for them," Jessica said. Hurrying into the kitchen, she gathered what she had in mind. Once she'd set the items in the garage, she nodded to Matt. He unlocked the man door that led to the backyard, opened it, peered outside, then closed it, leaving it unlocked. The four of them went back into the house, locked the door from the garage to the house, and walked to the front window. Brooke and Cleo stood where they'd left them. "You and Cleo go into the garage through the backyard door and lock it behind you," Matt said. "Knock on the door that leads to the house when you're safely inside the garage." A tentative smile lifted Brooke's lips. She nodded. "Okay." The four of them hustled to the door that led to the garage. A few moments later, a knock sounded on that door. I'm here, Brooke said. Is the door to the backyard locked? Matt asked. Yes. Okay. Do you have food for Cleo? Yes. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. Then he explained their plan. You and Cleo should have what you need to get you through until tomorrow evening. Thank you, she said through the door. Jessica could hear tears in her voice and wanted nothing more than to gather her daughter's best friend into her arms and tell her everything would be okay. She only hoped it would be, and that Brooke wasn't carrying the virus that had killed both her parents.